In the summer of 1986, workers draining a section of the Sea of Galilee's shoreline near Kibbutz Ginosa noticed something protruding from the newly exposed mud. They stopped. They called an archaeologist. What they had found was a fishing boat, buried in the silt of the lake bottom, extraordinarily well preserved by the anaerobic conditions of the mud. Carbon dating placed its construction between 100 BCE and 70 CE, squarely within the lifetime of Jesus of Nazareth. The boat was 8 meters long. It was built from at least 12 different species of wood, including cedar, oak, jujube, and willow. A patchwork of materials that told a story of repeated repair, of parts replaced as they wore out, of a working vessel maintained over decades by people who could not afford to build a new one from scratch. And the hull had been caulked with a mixture of tar and animal fat, recaulked in multiple layers, each layer marking a season when water began to get in, and someone had to fix it before the next night's fishing. When the boat finally came to the end of its useful life, every reusable piece of wood was stripped from it before it was abandoned. Nothing was wasted. Nothing could be. That boat is now in a museum in Kibbutz Ginosa, encased in a climate-controlled tank of preservative wax. It is the most direct physical connection we have to the working economy of first-century Galilee. Not a coin, not a tax record, not a document. A boat, an object built by hand for the purpose of making a living, repaired until it could not be repaired anymore, stripped of value at the end. It is the most honest economic document the period has left us. And this video is about the economy that boat came from, how people in Galilee at the time of Jesus actually made their money, and how the system that governed that economy shaped everything Jesus said, did, and chose to do with the 3 years of his public life. We are going to start from that boat, from the individual and the concrete, and move outward, through the fishing industry, through the agricultural economy, through the trade networks, through the tax structure, through the debt system, until we reach the full shape of the world that produced it. And at every step, something that seemed like a metaphor in the Gospels is going to turn out to be a description. The fishermen of the Sea of Galilee are among the most familiar figures in the entire New Testament. Simon Peter, Andrew, James, John, all of them fishermen, all of them called by Jesus while they were working, all of them dropping their nets and following him. The image has become iconic. Simple men beside a beautiful lake, free, independent, answering a higher call. The reality was different in almost every particular. The fishermen of the Sea of Galilee were not independent operators working a public resource. They worked within a licensing system controlled by Herod Antipas, the client king who ruled Galilee throughout Jesus' lifetime. The fishing rights on the lake were royal property. Cooperatives that wanted to fish commercially had to purchase those rights, paying fees up front and a percentage of the catch ongoing. The lake did not belong to the fishermen. They rented access to it, and the terms of that rental were set by the most powerful man in the region. And the cooperative structure is visible in the gospel accounts if you read them economically rather than theologically. Simon Peter and Andrew are partners with James and John, the sons of Zebedee. The Greek word used for their partnership, koinonoi, is a commercial term. They are co-investors in a business enterprise, not simply friends who happen to fish together. Zebedee is prosperous enough to employ hired workers in addition to his own sons. This means he has capital invested in equipment and ongoing labor costs. He is a small businessman with fixed assets and operating expenses. When his sons leave to follow Jesus, he does not just lose their company, he loses 2 members of his workforce. The equipment that workforce depended on was expensive and technically demanding. The Ginosa boat required skilled labor to build and constant investment to maintain. The nets were equally significant capital items. The main commercial net was the dragnet, the sajan in Greek, a long net deployed in a wide arc between 2 boats and then drawn close toward shore. It required coordination between crews, it accumulated damage over every use, and it had to be washed, mended and inspected after every night's work. Net maintenance was not a minor task. It was a daily professional obligation that occupied hours of every working morning. Fishing happened at night. This is another detail the Gospel accounts preserve accurately. The disciples fished through the night and return at dawn. The reasons were practical. The target species, primarily tilapia and sardines, were closer to the surface in the cooler nighttime water and more catchable with surface nets. The morning market required the catch to arrive fresh at first light, and the storms that made the Sea of Galilee dangerous. Sudden, violent winds generated by the pressure differentials between the lake's below sea level depression and the surrounding highlands were more likely in the afternoons. Night fishing was not romantic. It was uncomfortable, cold, and exhausting. It was also the schedule that made commercial sense. So here is the first contradiction. The fishermen of Galilee are presented in popular imagination and in much Christian devotion as free, simple, uncomplicated men working in harmony with nature. What the evidence shows is something quite different. Licensed operators working within a system of royal extraction, managing significant capital investments, employing wage labor, navigating tax obligations at multiple levels, and working through the night in conditions that were sometimes lethal. They were not poor, but they were not free. The lake was their workplace and their livelihood, and it belonged to someone else. The catch that came off the boats at dawn did not all go directly to the breakfast table. Most of it entered an industrial processing system that converted perishable protein into a stable, tradable commodity that could travel weeks away from the lake. Fresh fish spoils within hours in the Palestinian summer heat. A tilapia caught at midnight is unmarketable by midday if it has not been kept in cold water or immediately processed. Where the fishing economy of the Sea of Galilee solved this problem the same way fishing economies across the ancient Mediterranean solved it: salt, sun, and time. Fish were gutted, layered in large stone vats with coarse salt, left to cure for days, then dried on wooden racks in the open air. The result was a product with a shelf life measured in months rather than hours. A product that could be loaded onto pack animals and carried to markets in Damascus, Jerusalem, Caesarea Maritima, or anywhere the trade routes reached. The scale of this processing industry was substantial. The city of Magdala, on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, derives its Greek alternative name, Tarikaia, from the Greek word tarikos, meaning salted or preserved fish. The name tells you what the city was known for throughout the region. Archaeological excavations at Magdala have uncovered large stone processing installations, storage facilities, and the infrastructure of an industrial operation rather than a cottage industry. This was not families preserving a few fish for their own winter use. This was production for export markets. Beyond salt fish, the processing industry produced fish sauce, garum in Latin, a condiment made by fermenting small fish or fish offal in brine under the sun for weeks until the protein broke down into a liquid that was poured off and used as a flavor base for cooking across the entire Roman world. Garum from the Sea of Galilee region was traded commercially. It was not the elite product that the finest Spanish garum was, but it was a real commodity with real markets. The sardines caught in enormous quantities by the Galilean fishing fleets had a commercial destination even if they were too small to sail fresh. The processing industry created employment beyond the fishermen themselves. Salters and courers who worked the vats. Workers who tended the drying racks and turned the fish to ensure even drying. Pot makers who produced the ceramic amphorae in which processed fish traveled. Porters who loaded and unloaded the amphorae at the harbor. Merchants who bought processed fish wholesale and sold it in distant markets. Administrators who managed the storage facilities and negotiated with the trading caravans that came through on the Via Maris. And here is the second contradiction. The fish that Jesus uses in his feeding miracles, 5 loaves and 2 fish, are almost certainly dried or salted fish, not fresh ones. Fresh fish at a remote hillside location in the afternoon is not plausible. Preserved fish carried as provisions by people who have come a long distance to hear a teacher is exactly what the context describes. The miracle of abundance is set against a background of industrial food production designed to prevent scarcity, and it produces abundance anyway. The two fish are not incidental props. They are specific products of a specific industry that everyone in the audience recognized. Galilee was, by the standards of the ancient Near East, an exceptionally productive agricultural region. The rainfall was substantially higher than in Judea to the south, in some areas twice as much, falling between October and March in the reliable Mediterranean pattern of dry summers and wet winters. So the soils in the valleys were deep and dark with accumulated organic matter. The hillsides, carefully terraced over generations, supported olives and vines in conditions close to ideal. The Jezreel Valley to the south of Lower Galilee was one of the most productive grain plains in the entire eastern Mediterranean, a flat expanse of deep alluvial soil that had been farmed continuously for thousands of years. The primary crops formed the classic Mediterranean triad: grain, olive oil, and wine. Wheat and barley were grown in the valleys and on the lower slopes, harvested in spring, threshed on hilltop floors where the wind could separate grain from chaff, stored in stone-lined pits or large ceramic jars. Olives dominated the middle slopes, requiring minimal labor through most of the year, but demanding intensive work at a harvest time in autumn, when crews moved through the groves with long poles, beating the branches to bring the fruit down onto spread cloths below. Grapes covered the sunnier upper terraces, harvested in late summer, pressed in stone treading floors whose channels led to collection vats below. Secondary crops filled the spaces and the seasons between the main harvests. Figs, both fresh and dried, were a dietary staple. Pomegranates, almonds, and walnuts provided variety and nutrition. Lentils, chickpeas, and broad beans were the primary protein sources for households that could not afford meat. Flax was grown in the Jordan Valley for linen fiber. Vegetables, onions, garlic, leeks, cucumbers were grown in kitchen gardens beside the houses. Now, the agricultural calendar was dense and continuous. There was always something to plant, tend, or harvest. But here is the third contradiction, and it is the most important one in understanding the Galilee that Jesus lived in. By the 1st century CE, a large and growing proportion of this productive agricultural land was no longer owned by the people who worked it. The consolidation of land ownership that had been underway since the Hasmonean period had accelerated under Herodian rule. Large estates owned by wealthy families in Jerusalem, Sepphoris, and Tiberias covered areas that had once been small holdings of independent farming families. The original owners had not always sold voluntarily. Many had lost their land to debt foreclosure, the precise process that the Torah's Jubilee provisions had been designed to prevent, and that was happening systematically anyway. The former small farmers became tenant farmers or sharecroppers, working the same land their families had owned for generations and paying a substantial share of the harvest to an absentee landlord who lived in a city and appeared only at collection time. The standard sharecropping arrangement in 1st century Palestine, attested in both rabbinic sources and papyri from Roman Egypt describing similar conditions, required tenants to pay between 1/3 and 1/2 of the crop to the landowner. After paying the landowner, paying the Roman tribute, paying the temple tax, and setting aside seed grain for the next planting, a tenant farmer family had very little left. The parable of the tenants, in which a landowner plants a vineyard, leases it to tenant farmers, and sends servants to collect the harvest only to have them beaten or killed, is not a story about willfully violent people. It is a story about the accumulation of grievance in a population that has been dispossessed and knows it, that resents the representatives of an ownership class they consider illegitimate, and that is eventually willing to commit extreme acts out of a desperate and ultimately futile hope that if they kill the heir, the land might revert to them. The violence in the parable is economically logical. It makes sense in the context of Galilee in the first century in a way that purely allegorical readings miss entirely. The day laborers in the parable of the vineyard workers, hired in successive waves from morning to the 11th hour, were the final product of this land consolidation process. And these were men who had lost the last connection to the land, who owned no tools, no draft animals, no plot to cultivate. They gathered in the town marketplace before dawn, waiting to be hired for the day's work. The wage of 1 denarius for a full day was standard and barely sufficient to feed a family. The men still standing in the marketplace at the 5th hour were not lazy. They had not been hired yet, and if they were not hired by sunset, their children would go to bed hungry. Galilee sat at the intersection of some of the most important trade routes in the ancient Near East. The Via Maris, the Way of the Sea, was the primary coastal road connecting Egypt to Damascus and the cities of Mesopotamia beyond. It entered Galilee from the southwest through the Jezreel Valley, crossed the plain, climbed the hills near Nazareth, and descended to the north shore of the Sea of Galilee near Capernaum, and then turned northeast toward the Golan Heights and Damascus. Every caravan traveling that route passed through the heart of Galilee. A second major route ran north-south through the Jordan Valley, connecting the Dead Sea region and Jericho in the south with the cities of the north. A third connected the Mediterranean coast at Ptolemais, modern Acre, to the interior of Galilee and onward to Damascus. Galilee was not peripheral to the commerce of the ancient world. It was a transit zone through which that commerce continuously moved. What moved along these routes was the full range of commodities that the first-century Mediterranean economy traded. Grain from the Jezreel Valley going north, salted fish from the Sea of Galilee going south and west, and olive oil in ceramic amphorae going everywhere. Wine traveling in both directions, spices from the Arabian Peninsula, cinnamon, frankincense, myrrh, black pepper, carried by the Nabatean trading caravans that specialized in the long-distance luxury trade from the east, cloth from Phoenicia to the north, Egyptian papyrus and linen going north, Syrian glass going south, Roman manufactured goods, bronze tools, fine pottery, lead weights, distributed outward from the imperial manufacturing centers. This continuous commercial traffic created secondary economic activity throughout Galilee. Innkeepers along the major routes provided accommodation, food, fodder for animals, and basic medical care for travelers. To the Pandosion, the inn that the Good Samaritan uses in the parable, is a precise economic institution, a business that charges a daily rate, accepts payment in coin, extends credit to regular customers or trustworthy strangers, and employs domestic workers. The 2 denarii the Samaritan leaves with the innkeeper represent 2 days of lodging and care at the standard rate. The detail is economically specific, not decorative. Money changers operated at every major market and toll station, converting the various currencies in circulation. Roman denarii, Herodian copper coins, Tyrian shekels required for the temple tax, provincial coinage from Syria and Egypt carried by traders, into whatever denomination a particular transaction required. The exchange rate was never exactly neutral. The money changer's profit came from the spread between buying and selling rates, and in a commercial environment where multiple currencies were in regular circulation, that spread was both necessary and subject to abuse. Craftsmen who supplied the caravan trade worked in the towns along the major routes. Sandal makers whose products wore out on the road. Leather workers who repaired harness and saddlebags. Blacksmiths who reshod pack animals and repaired iron tools. Potters who replaced broken storage vessels. Rope makers who supplied the cordage that held loads together. All of these were real occupations in real Galilean towns, supported by the continuous demand of commercial traffic. And here is the fourth contradiction. All of this commercial activity generated real economic value. Galilee was not a poor or unproductive region in absolute terms. Its agriculture was among the most productive in the Eastern Mediterranean. Its fishing industry fed the region and exported surplus across the empire. Its position on major trade routes gave its towns a commercial vitality that landlocked agricultural regions lacked. The problem was not that Galilee produced too little. The problem was where the value it produced ended up. The fishing licenses paid fees to Herod Antipas. The trade tolls flowed to the royal treasury. The grain from the large estates went to the landlords in Sepphoris and Jerusalem. The temple tax traveled south to Jerusalem twice a year. The Roman tribute left the province entirely. Galilee was productive, and that productivity was systematically drained away from the people who produced it. And the Roman imperial economy in the 1st century operated on a principle that was simple and brutal. The empire extracted value from its provinces and used that value to fund the army that kept the provinces subject. The circularity was explicit and unashamed. You paid taxes to maintain the soldiers who would enforce your payment of taxes. In Galilee, the extraction worked through several overlapping layers. At the top was the Roman tribute, the direct tax owed to Rome by the client kingdom of Herod Antipas. The amount was fixed by negotiation between Antipas and the imperial authorities and was ultimately derived from the agricultural and commercial output of the territory. Antipas paid Rome and recovered the payment from the population through his own tax apparatus. The Herodian tax system covered multiple categories. So there was a land tax assessed on agricultural output, typically collected as a proportion of the harvest rather than a fixed monetary amount, which meant the tax collector needed to assess the yield before collection and had significant discretion in that assessment. There were commercial tolls on goods transported along the roads and through the harbors. There were market fees for the right to sell in the town marketplace. There was a toll on fishing, the licensing system described earlier. There were corvée obligations, requirements for free labor on public works that could be commuted to cash payment by those who could afford it. Below the Herodian taxes came the temple obligations, and every Jewish male above the age of 20 owed the temple a half shekel annually, a tax that funded the operation of the temple in Jerusalem and the priestly establishment that ran it. The half shekel had to be paid in Tyrian currency because of its silver content, which meant that most people had to exchange their local coins for Tyrian shekels before paying, creating the market for money changers that Jesus dramatically disrupted when he overturned the tables in the temple court. Beyond the half shekel, the Torah prescribed a system of agricultural tithes. The first tithe, 10% of all agricultural produce, went to the Levites who served the temple. A second tithe, another 10%, was either consumed in Jerusalem during festival pilgrimages or redeemed for money and brought to Jerusalem to be spent there. During sabbatical years, there was a tithe for the poor. In practice, the full tithe system, if observed, represented a substantial additional tax burden on top of the Herodian and Roman obligations. Historians who have attempted to calculate the total tax burden on a typical Galilean farming or fishing family have arrived at figures ranging from 30 to 40% of annual income. This is not a comfortable margin above subsistence. For a family already producing barely enough to eat, a 30% extraction rate meant chronic insufficiency. A bad year, a drought, a crop disease, a fishing failure, a family illness that reduced labor capacity, pushed families from chronic insufficiency into acute crisis. And acute crisis meant debt. The collection mechanism made everything worse. Roman and Herodian taxes were not collected by polite civil servants. They were collected by men who had paid for the right to collect. The publicani and their local agents, the telones, and who recovered their investment plus a profit from the population. The incentive structure rewarded aggressive collection. A collector who assessed generously and collected efficiently made more money than one who was fair and lenient. The legal backing for collection was ultimately the military force of the garrison, which gave collectors an effective monopoly on coercive power. Matthew, sitting at his tax booth in Capernaum, was one of these collectors. He worked the customs post on the Via Maris. assessing duties on commercial traffic. And he was not collecting Roman tribute directly. That was a different category. But he was collecting Herodian commercial tolls on behalf of a system that extracted value from the population and sent it upward. He was, by any reasonable community standard, a collaborator. He knew it. His neighbors knew it. The social exclusion that the Gospels describe, tax collectors and sinners as a single category of the ritually unclean, reflected a genuine community judgment about what his work meant. When Jesus called Matthew and then had dinner at his house with other tax collectors, he was not making a vague point about acceptance and forgiveness. So he was performing a specific social act with specific economic meaning, publicly associating with men who were economically complicit in the system that was crushing the population he was otherwise teaching. The scandal this caused was proportional to how serious that complicity was. It was very serious. Debt was not an occasional misfortune in first-century Galilee. It was a structural condition. It was built into the arithmetic of the tax system and the vulnerability of the agricultural calendar. A family producing barely enough to survive after taxes, with no financial reserve and no insurance against crop failure or illness, needed only a single bad season to fall into debt. And the debt system, once entered, had a gravitational pull that was very hard to escape. Seed grain was the most common point of entry. Planting required seed, and seed came from the previous harvest. If the previous harvest had been eaten, because the family was hungry, because the tax assessment had taken more than expected, because a family member's illness had prevented proper harvest management, the family had to borrow seed to plant the next crop. The lender was typically a wealthier neighbor, a local merchant, or a professional money lender operating from one of the nearby towns. The loan carried an interest charge, expressed in various legal forms because direct interest on loans between Jews was prohibited by Torah, but functionally present in most transactions. The Torah's Jubilee provisions had been designed precisely to prevent the permanent dispossession of Israelite families from their ancestral land. Every 7th year, debts between Israelites were to be released. Every 50th year, land was to revert to its ancestral owners. The provisions represented a systematic attempt to prevent the accumulation of land wealth and the creation of a permanent landless underclass. They were also, by the 1st century, largely inoperative. The mechanism of their defeat was the prosbul, a legal instrument developed by Hillel the Elder, the great Pharisaic teacher who was the dominant legal mind of the generation immediately preceding Jesus. The prosbul allowed a creditor to transfer a private loan to a court before the sabbatical year, converting it from a private debt subject to the Jubilee release into an institutional debt held by the court, which was not subject to the release. The creditor could then collect after the sabbatical year, as if the release had not occurred. The prosbul was developed according to the rabbinic sources, because lenders had begun refusing to make loans as the sabbatical year approached, fearing they would not be repaid. The intent was to keep credit flowing. The effect was to nullify the Torah's primary protection for debtors. The word for debt in Aramaic is choba. It is also the word for sin. This is not a coincidence or a metaphor. In the social world of first-century Galilee, the moral and economic dimensions of obligation were not separated. A man who owed money to a creditor was in a condition of subjection, moral, social, and financial, that the language captured in a single word. When Jesus taught his disciples to pray for the forgiveness of debts as we forgive our debtors, he was using the most concrete language available to describe a condition his audience understood from personal experience. The Lord's Prayer, in its original Aramaic context, was at least partly a prayer about money. The parable of the unforgiving servant makes the economic reality explicit. A king forgives a servant a debt of 10,000 talents, a deliberately absurd sum, the equivalent of roughly 60 million daily wages, more money than the entire annual tax revenue of several Roman provinces combined. The servant then refuses to forgive a fellow servant a debt of 100 denarii, 100 days' wages, a real and meaningful sum, but not ruinous. The contrast in scale is the point. The forgiveness the servant has received is so enormous it cannot be calculated. And when the debt he refuses to forgive is so comparatively small, it is almost insulting. The audience understood both numbers. They lived with debts measured in denarii. The parable worked because it was economically precise. Debtor's prison was not a metaphor. In the first-century Roman legal system, a debtor who could not pay could be imprisoned until the debt was paid, either by the debtor working off the obligation in some form, or by family members raising the money, or by a benefactor paying on the debtor's behalf. The threat behind every unpaid debt was ultimately physical confinement. The urgency in the parable of the debtor being dragged before the judge. Make friends with your adversary quickly while you're on the way to court with him, or he may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer. And you will be thrown in prison was not a literary device. It was a description of legal procedure. 6 kilometers north of Nazareth, Herod Antipas had built a showcase city. Sepphoris, called Autokratoris in Greek, the city of the emperor, was the jewel of Galilee. It had a Roman-style theater, a colonnaded main street, a sophisticated water system with underground cisterns and distribution pipes, houses with mosaic floors and plastered walls, a public market, administrative buildings, and all the amenities of Hellenistic urban civilization. It was, by any standard, impressive. It had been substantially rebuilt by Antipas after its destruction during the revolts that followed the death of Herod the Great in 4 BCE. The reconstruction was ongoing throughout the childhood and early adulthood of Jesus. And Nazareth was an hour's walk away. The building trades of the region had continuous work in Sepphoris for decades. Joseph, described in the Gospels as a tekton, a craftsman who worked in wood and stone, almost certainly worked there. Jesus, following his father's trade, probably worked there as well. The urban economy of Sepphoris was qualitatively different from the agricultural and fishing economy of the surrounding villages. The city was a center of administration, commerce, and elite consumption. It housed the officials who managed Herod Antipas's tax collection apparatus for Galilee. It housed merchants who traded across regional and long-distance markets. It housed artisans who produced luxury goods for the wealthy households of the city itself. It housed a substantial population of service workers, cooks, domestic servants, and laborers, whose employment depended on the spending of the wealthy. Walking from Nazareth to Sepphoris was, in economic terms, walking between two different worlds. Nazareth was a subsistence agricultural village of a few hundred people, where most families struggled to produce enough to cover their obligations. Sepphoris was a city where wealthy households displayed their prosperity in mosaic floors, imported wine, elaborate dinner parties, and architectural competition. The same tax system that kept Nazareth poor funded the elite consumption of Sepphoris. The grain that a tenant farmer paid to his absentee landlord ended up on the table of a house with a mosaic floor. Tiberias, founded by Antipas around 20 CE on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, was the final piece of the Herodian urban project in Galilee, and it was built on the site of an ancient cemetery, which made it ritually impure under Jewish law and meant that its initial population was largely non-Jewish. Freed slaves, foreign settlers, people who had nothing to lose by living in an impure location. Antipas built it as his personal capital, naming it after the Emperor Tiberius to demonstrate his loyalty to Rome. It had a palace, a great synagogue, a stadium, colonnaded streets. It was the most Roman-looking city in Galilee, and it was built entirely with money extracted from the Galilean countryside. The Gospels note, almost in passing, that Jesus never appears to have entered Tiberias. He teaches throughout the region of the Sea of Galilee. He travels to the eastern shore and back. He is present in every town along the northern shore. But the city of Tiberias the political and administrative capital of the territory, is absent from his itinerary. Whether this was deliberate avoidance of the city his host Antipas had named after his overlord the emperor, or simply a reflection of the fact that his ministry was directed toward the working population of fishing towns and agricultural villages, rather than the administrative and merchant classes of the capital, the effect is the same. Jesus operated in the economy of the poor, not the economy of the powerful, even when the economy of the powerful was within walking distance. The formal economy of first-century Galilee, the fishing licenses, the tax records, the commercial contracts, the property deeds, was almost entirely conducted by men. Women appear in these documents rarely and in limited capacities, except a widow managing an estate, a daughter named in an inheritance document, a woman listed as the owner of a house. The formal economic record gives the impression that women's economic role was marginal. The household economy tells a different story. The household in first-century Galilee was a unit of production, not merely consumption. The labor that kept it functioning was substantial, skilled, and economically essential, and most of it was performed by women. Grain grinding was the most time-consuming single task in daily household management. Wheat or barley had to be ground fresh each day because ground flour went stale quickly in the Palestinian climate. Two women working together at a rotary stone hand mill, the lower stone fixed, to the upper stone turned by a wooden handle, could grind enough flour for a family's daily bread in 2 to 3 hours of continuous work. Jesus references this scene precisely. Two women will be grinding at the mill. The image required no explanation for his audience. Everyone had grown up with that sound, that rhythm, that muscle memory. Textile production was a major component of household economic output. Raw wool from local sheep and flax from the Jordan Valley were processed entirely in the household, washed, carded, spun into thread on a hand spindle, woven on an upright loom installed in the courtyard or main room of the house. A skilled woman who could spin fine, even thread and weave cloth with a tight regular weave produced goods with market value beyond the household's own needs. Though the sale or barter of homespun cloth was a real secondary income stream for many households, invisible in the formal commercial record but economically real. The management of household food stores required genuine economic skill. A woman managing a family's food supply was making continuous decisions about allocation, preservation, substitution, and timing. How much grain to grind today? When to open the last jar of olive oil? Whether to buy the more expensive dried figs or save the money for something the family needed more urgently. The parable of the woman who has 10 silver coins and loses one, who lights a lamp and sweeps the entire house carefully until she finds it, is a story about a woman managing a sum of money that represents real household savings, not pocket change. So her relief when she finds it is proportional to what it represented, a family's financial cushion against the next crisis. The Galilean women who supported Jesus' ministry, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, the wife of Chuza, who was Herod's steward, Susanna, and others described as providing for Jesus and his disciples out of their own resources, were not providing sentimental moral support. They were providing money. The Greek verb used, diakonein, covers a range of practical service, and in this context it clearly includes financial provision. These women had resources. Joanna, in particular, as the wife of a royal steward, had access to household wealth at a level far above the fishing families of Capernaum. The ministry of Jesus was funded in part by women whose economic agency the formal record of the period almost entirely ignores. See, the temple in Jerusalem was not only the religious center of Jewish life, it was one of the largest economic institutions in the ancient Near East. Its operating scale, the daily sacrifices, the priestly staff, the Levitical musicians and guards, the administrative apparatus, the construction projects that continued under Herod the Great and were still ongoing at the time of Jesus, required enormous ongoing income, and the mechanisms for generating that income reached into every Jewish household in Galilee, in Judea, in the diaspora communities of Egypt, Babylon, Rome, and across the Mediterranean. The half-shekel temple tax was the most direct expression of this reach. Every Jewish male above the age of 20 owed the temple 1/2 shekel annually, payable in Tyrian silver, a specific currency requirement because Tyrian shekels had a reliably high silver content, while Roman and Herodian coins were considered unsuitable for the sacred treasury. The practical consequence was that most Jews paying the temple tax had to first exchange their local currency for Tyrian shekels. The money changers who operated in the temple court and at major pilgrimage assembly points throughout Galilee were providing a genuinely necessary service. They were also extracting a fee for that service, and in the confined market of religious obligation, you had to pay in Tyrian silver, you had to pay through them. The exchange rates were not necessarily fair. The pilgrimage economy created by the three major festivals, Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles, generated substantial economic activity throughout the route from Galilee to Jerusalem. Galilean families making the 3-day journey to Jerusalem for Passover needed provisions for the road, animals for the temple sacrifice, accommodation in or around the city, and food for the week-long stay. The Jerusalem economy in festival season operated at extraordinary scale. A city of perhaps 80,000 permanent residents receiving 200,000 or more pilgrims, all of whom needed to eat, sleep, and worship. The prices for everything, accommodation, food, sacrificial animals, were high during festivals. The vendors who specialized in festival commerce, including the animal sellers and money changers in the temple courts themselves, who operated in conditions of price inelasticity that invited exploitation. The priestly families who controlled the temple operation were among the wealthiest people in Judea. Archaeological excavations in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem have uncovered the mansions of the priestly aristocracy, multi-story houses with elaborate mosaic floors, private ritual baths, imported pottery, and the material markers of wealth at the top of the first-century social scale. These families derived their income from the temple revenues, a share of the sacrificial offerings, fees from the temple-based commercial operations, the proceeds of lending against temple deposits, and the political benefits of cooperation with Rome. They were not ascetics, they were an establishment, and the tension between this priestly establishment and the population they served was embedded in the Galilean consciousness long before Jesus. The prophetic tradition that Jesus drew on, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, Micah, was full of condemnations of religious institutions that had become instruments of exploitation rather than channels of divine care. When Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers in the temple court, he was performing an action with a long prophetic pedigree. He was also, in practical terms, disrupting a system of embedded commercial advantage that the priestly families who controlled the temple court had authorized and probably profited from directly. The response of the chief priests and scribes, they began looking for a way to kill him, was not theologically motivated. It was economically and politically motivated. He had attacked their business. The Galilean relationship to the temple was complicated by geography and by politics. Galileans were faithful Jews who observed the pilgrimage obligations, paid the temple tax, and maintained deep emotional and theological investment in the temple as the dwelling place of God. They were also people who were aware, at some level, that the institution they were supporting was controlled by families whose interests were not their own, who cooperated with the Roman occupation, and whose wealth came partly from the same extractive mechanisms that kept Galilean farming families in chronic insufficiency. The combination of genuine religious devotion and structural resentment was not comfortable. It was, however, deeply human. And it was the soil in which Jesus' critique of the religious establishment landed with such extraordinary force. The road from Jericho to Jerusalem, The setting of the Good Samaritan parable was not a metaphorical space. It was a specific road, approximately 27 kilometers of descent through the Judean wilderness, dropping more than 1,000 meters in elevation from the Jordan Valley to the highland plateau where Jerusalem sat. It was notoriously dangerous. Josephus and other ancient sources describe it as a frequent location for robbery. The terrain, rocky ravines, sparse vegetation, few habitations, provided cover for bandits and limited the victim's options for escape or assistance. The bandits on that road were not random criminals operating outside all social logic. In the first century, the line between bandit and dispossessed peasant was frequently crossed in both directions. Men who had lost their land to debt foreclosure, who had no agricultural work available, who faced starvation with their families. Some of those men became bandits. Not because they were morally different from their neighbors, but because the alternative was slower death by hunger. The social history of first-century Galilee and Judea documents repeated cycles of rural dispossession, followed by banditry, followed by Roman military suppression, followed by more dispossession. The man left half dead on the Jericho road in the parable is not a named character. He has no social category assigned to him. He is simply a man, stripped of his clothing, which would have identified his social class, his regional origin, thus his religious affiliation, and left without resources in a dangerous place. The priest who passes by is not a villain in the simple sense. He is a man following ritual purity rules that prohibited contact with a potentially dead body, rules that would have rendered him unable to perform his temple duties if violated. He is doing what his institution has trained him to do. The Levite behaves similarly. The Samaritan, a member of a group the Jewish audience would have expected to be the villain, not the hero, has no institutional obligations pulling him away. He simply sees a human being in need and responds. The economic details of the parable are precise. The Samaritan uses his own oil and wine as medical supplies. Both were real first-century wound treatments. He loads the man on his own animal, meaning he walks. He pays the innkeeper 2 denarii up front and promises to cover any additional costs on his return. He is not wealthy in the way the temple establishment was wealthy. He is a traveler with sufficient resources to absorb a significant unplanned expense without calculation, and he does absorb it without negotiation, without expectation of repayment, without any apparent consideration of whether the man deserved it. The parable's economic precision is not incidental. It is the argument. This is what care looks like when it is not mediated by institutional obligation or social calculation. It is expensive, inconvenient, and completely unambiguous. We began with a boat, 8 meters of patched cedar and oak, built to last, repaired until it couldn't be, stripped at the end of everything reusable. On the most honest economic document the period left us. From that boat we have traced the full shape of the economy it came from. The fishing licensing system that meant the lake did not belong to the fishermen who worked it. The processing industry that converted perishable catch into tradable commodity. The agricultural economy in which the most productive land in the region was owned by people who did not work it. The trade routes that moved wealth through Galilee while ensuring that the wealth moved mostly out. The tax system that extracted between 1/3 and 1/2 of everything the population produced and sent it upward toward Jerusalem, toward Sepphoris, toward Rome. The debt system that turned a single bad season into a multi-generational trap. The urban economy of Sepphoris and Tiberias that displayed the proceeds of that extraction in mosaic floors and colonnaded streets. The temple institution that drew on Galilean devotion while serving interests that were not Galilean. The road where dispossession eventually produced its own desperate logic. Every parable Jesus told about money was a description of this system. The absentee landlord, the day laborers at the 11th hour, the debtor dragged before the judge, the king settling accounts with servants, the woman searching for her lost coin, the father dividing his estate between his sons, the priest and the Levite who walked by. the Samaritan who stopped. These were not invented scenarios. They were the recurring situations of Galilean economic life. They're recognized instantly by everyone who heard them because they had lived them or watched their neighbors live them. The Sermon on the Mount begins with the Beatitudes. In the Greek text of Matthew, these are partially spiritualized formulations. In the parallel version in Luke, "Blessed are you who are poor. Blessed are you who are hungry now. Blessed are you who weep now." They are not spiritualized at all. They are statements addressed directly to specific economic and social conditions that the audience inhabited. The people Jesus was speaking to were poor. They were hungry. They did weep. He was not telling them that their poverty was spiritually meaningful in the abstract. He was telling them that the system that produced their poverty was not the final word on what the world could be. And the economy of first-century Galilee did not end with the first century. The specific institutions, the Roman tribute, the Herodian fishing licenses, the prosbul, are historical artifacts. But the structure those institutions embodied, productive labor generating value that flows systematically away from the people who produce it, sustained by legal frameworks that neutralize the protections originally designed for the vulnerable, is not a historical artifact. It is a description of conditions recognizable in many parts of the world right now. The Ginosa boat is in a museum. The lake it came from still exists. The hills where Jesus taught are still there. The economic logic that determined who owned the fish in the water, who owed taxes on the catch, and who stood in the marketplace at the 11th hour still waiting to be hired. That logic did not stay in the first century. It traveled, understanding it precisely in its original context with all the archaeological and historical detail we have recovered. That is not an academic exercise. It is the only way to read what Jesus actually said to the people he actually said it to in the world they were actually living in. Everything else is reading the words without hearing the voice behind them. And the voice was speaking with perfect economic precision about a world it intended to change.